I wonder why they did that. But that's the problem with using the free shit is like whenever they want to update it, you're at their mercy.
Yep. Yep. I can always just create a manual box that shows each person and just move it wherever I want. But it was so much easier when I just had the one just pick up the screen. But it is fixable. So, all right, now I have to check the chat, make sure everything's showing up. Is the sound good? Question mark. Sound good? Question mark. All right. Yeah, last time I had this really weird glitch where it was it didn't shut off the live stream, like when I clicked in stream, and it just kept repeating the last 5 seconds of the video for the next 8 hours. And then when I started the next stream, it picked up the last like minute of the new stream and just tacked it on the end of the old one. I was like, what is this? But I got a lot of super chats in that time when it was just didn't go offline. I got a whole bunch of super chats. It was hilarious. I was like, all right, cool.
That's your new go-to method.
Yep. Just live stream 24 hours, repeat the last 5 seconds. It's fine.
Exactly.
All right. Travis says the sound is good. We are live. So, Richard, thanks for coming on again. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. How are things going with you? Any interesting stuff in philosophy to talk about today?
Things are going well for me. Lots of interesting things going on. I finally got my PlayStation 5, which is the big news for me. So I'm excited about that. And I got the Xbox Series S, which I'm fully geared up now. Other than that,
I noticed you've grown some extensions.
Yeah, exactly. I got to keep the haters guessing, so change things up every now and again, just so in case anyone's looking, they're not checking for this.
Did you get any of the new games for PS5? I haven't really seen any that I've been really interested in yet. That's why I've kind of like held off. I usually wait a few months till all the games come out, then it's really worth it. Because right when it comes out, there's like one game. It lasts me like a week, and then I just like put it in the corner and don't touch it.
Yeah, I know. So right now it's just Demon's Souls, which is the main thing for me, and that'll keep me occupied, I think, until some of the other things that come out that I'm more interested in.
Have you played it before, or is this their first time with Demon's Souls?
Oh no, no. Bloodborne, Demon's Souls, those are my jams. Yeah.
Yeah. It was.
I mean, some people say it's too hard. I'm old, so I remember when video games just were hard, and then the people who made them were just like, "Fuck you!" Like you're gonna die if someone touches you. Like that's it. You're fucking done, dude. That's it. So I guess there's been a kind of they made it easier because people got frustrated. So I think there's been a kind of in the development program, community or whatever, doing it on purpose, simplifying and making things easier to do. And I don't know. To me, that's kind of I like the challenge. So yeah, I like those hard games that are just like, dude, you're fucked.
Yeah, I was like, that'd be disappointing if they made it easier because it wasn't that hard. Like it's like a average level game on the index scale. Like Ninja Gaiden was hard. Ninja Gaiden was insanely hard, and then Cloudberry Kingdom was just ridiculous. But Dark Souls was like a decent hard. It wasn't like a hard. So I don't know why people were complaining. It's like
people were like so angry about that. I know it's like I actually thought that was fun. I mean, it was a challenge. Definitely, it wasn't like over the top challenging, but definitely it was a challenge. So
yeah, for sure. Yeah. Like the kind of games I really don't like are the kind where you die and it deletes your save file. Like that's a little too much. I can't do that. That's like put in 8 hours and you like have to restart. Like nope. I always cheat in those, like copy my save file to a USB so I can always just plug it back in. Like, haha, I've beaten the system.
Yeah, you're like one of those guys who have your D&D character and you die and you're like, no, he's back. It's a twin. It's his twin brother.
Exactly. So what's been going on in the philosophy world? You said you had a recent lecture on colors and, oh God, colors and shapes prove God. That was a fun one. For mine, different thing.
Someone said colors and shapes prove God?
Yes, they said shapes prove God and colors prove Jesus.
Can you catch me up on that? What happened there?
It was a dumpster fire. I could not understand a bit of the conclusion he was making. It was something like fire comes in 3 colors, red, blue, and green, and that's the 3 primary colors, which is indicated by the Bible, and the Bible wouldn't lie, therefore Jesus, something like that.
Wow. I always love the magic conclusion at the end, therefore whatever the fuck. Yeah. Wow. So yeah, no, I mean, I was just at a talk on colors, but philosopher Mark Johnston was arguing. I mean, I literally just left. They were just starting the Q&A right now, but he was arguing that these aren't mental properties, and they're not physical properties either, but they're in some other category of things, which is neither mental nor physical. Pretty interesting stuff, but. So I'm still thinking about it, but I'm not really sure what I think about it, to be honest. But because I mean, yeah, there was a lot of details in his argument. He's a really great philosopher, by the way. If people don't know, Mark Johnston's a top-notch philosopher. He knows a lot of stuff about colors and the psychology and physics of it as well. But I think part of the thing that he was arguing was that um, there are certain kinds of color experiences that we have which don't fit into the categories that we like to chop things into. Um, so certain colors that things like super saturated red, which is a certain type of color experience you can have. I guess what you have to do to get that kind of experience is put someone in a dark room and then shine green light at them for 20 minutes, and then they have them look at a non-colored white thing, and then put a regular red underneath it. And so the after image that they have a red after image from looking at the green light. It's really strong. And then they put the red object right there. And then what they have is an experience of a shade of red that's super saturated, that there is no, it goes beyond the normal color will. And so it's not a property that any objects in the environment have. And so anyway, I don't know. There's lots of interesting things like that he was talking about. But part of what he was doing was debunking like the Mary argument and showing how he thought that rested on a mistake. But the mistake was in thinking that the colors were the experiences that we have are mental, which I mean, to me, that's the way I would think about them. So it was a bit, wasn't exactly sure what to make of that.
So he said they were not physical and not mental. So was it like a platonic object kind of a thing, or like an abstract object that exists?
Yeah. I don't know. I was going to ask him about that afterwards, but so I guess what he was saying that they are, it's, I mean, I just literally only just heard him talk about it, and I'm probably doing a bad job of like relaying it. But what he was saying was that they are Fregean modes of presentation. So like Frege's idea that you have these things called modes of presentation where you think about these objects, but under a certain kind of description. So he was, part of the argument was that a lot of people who think about color are stuck in a kind of way of thinking about them that's like an old school empiricist way of thinking about them, where we just are presented with the things themselves, but not under any mode of presentation. So he thought they were these kinds of things that he called expanses, which are not subjective and not mentalistic, but they're not physical either. So yeah, what other category they are, I don't know, but um, I found it. I mean, it's a challenging idea to make sense of, to be sure.
And he was arguing that the super saturation thing broke out of the categories of normal colors and wouldn't, it wouldn't just put that as like an extension on vision, kind of like we know the mantis shrimp can see much more, and octopuses can see a much broader spectrum of light than we can. Do you think he'd argue that that super saturated redness would somehow fall in a separate category than just that expanded vision of light?
Yeah, what I think what his point was that it's visual, so that it reveals to us the way the object is. Something about so he's sort of like a semi-direct realist in this sense, who thinks that we have like perception of the objects themselves, and these things don't stand in the way. So if you know the history of this stuff, maybe you don't, so maybe you do, I don't know. But anyway, so there's this old school idea that goes all the way back to like the early empiricists, which is that we have this kind of veil of perception, that in color experience, what happens is we have these mental items, so when we perceive an ordinary object, according to this view, we don't perceive the object directly, but rather instead what we perceive as a mental representation of the object. And in the modern period, like with Locke and those kinds of guys, that was kind of the tip. That was their go-to thing. And then in the contemporary period, the logical positivists had this idea as well. They called them sense data. So then the kind of argument for sense data went as follows. So suppose you have a hallucination of a pink elephant. Well, something is pink, but there's no pink objects in your environment. So there must be something which you are aware of, which has the property of being pink. So that was their idea for sense data. And these things they literally stand between you and the objects in the external environment. By the way, just to relate this to some other things, this is sometimes people like idealists they like to think this way. That's Bernardo talks about the screen of perception. That's kind of a straightforward reinterpretation of that idea, that there are these mental things through which we indirectly perceive the external environment, but we're not directly in contact with the external environment, but only through these intermediary. So that's not a great idea, because you get left with these weird things. So the people moved on from that, and now people talk about, we represent the colors, but we have mental states which represent the objects as being a certain way, but still we're directly perceiving the objects themselves. So I don't know, there's a whole big literature on this, right? So when you hear a sound, like if I hear the door shut, am I hearing the door shut, or am I hearing a sound and then judging that that's the door shutting? So that's a big debate in the philosophy of perception about which things you're actually perceiving, which properties it is that figure in perception. So he was saying, the Johnson guy, he was saying that these things are not sense data. They're not qualia in the traditional sense of the word qualia, by which we mean some kind of mental representation of the subject or something like that, which is distinct or depends on the person, but they're in a third category. And so, yeah, that I don't know what that third category is supposed to be, but that was what he's arguing.
That's really interesting.
It is really interesting. He's got a couple of papers on this. I was going to go and read them because he was mentioning those papers in the talk. So, but he's a really smart guy, and so he's not just making this crap up. There's an argument there, and it's worth thinking about, I think. Yeah. But certainly what I was wondering about when I was listening to it is so he went through the Mary argument, and the idea was there's a certain point at which Mary learns what it's like to see red. And his criticism of that was that it assumes that what she learns is a mental fact, that what it's like to see red for her is something mental, which I think is correct, the correct way of thinking about it. But he was saying that's a mistake, that what it's like to see red isn't, the redness is not a mental feature of hers, but it's not a physical feature of the object either. One kind of idea that he brought up, which is really cool, was this particular, there's a lot of details here, but just one of the things that he brought up was this kind of substance. I think it was, what was it called? It was called something, but it implements something called the Jablonski process. So you have this kind of material that's coated with this other stuff. I forget what the name of it is. But when the light shines on it, what happens, instead of the light reflecting back at you, it absorbs the light and excites the electrons or the particles which are in the material, which then radiate light in a lower frequency. So that what you're seeing is not just the reflected light from the object, but some other kind of process which occurs. And so it gives rise to these kind of day glow colors, like a day glow orange and things of that nature. So then his question was, well, what's the real color of the object? It's not what light that's being reflected at you, because the light that's being reflected is different than the light which is being emitted and so forth. So a lot of interesting. And yeah, anyway, so like I said, I literally just heard it, so I haven't really absorbed the entire thing. I'm probably doing a terrible. If he was here right now, he'd probably say, "Shut the fuck
up." Yeah, I've always found those kinds of arguments very interesting, because from my perspective, it's always it's a thing in your brain. It's the cones that are literally in your eyes being processed in your brain in some way. And if we just stimulated you in the right way, we could generate the same sensation. So how could it not be a physical thing? How does it diverge from being just a physical sensation to this other kind of thing?
Yeah, well, I think a large part of it depends on what you're using the word color to indicate. So that word's ambiguous. We call the objects red and green and so forth, but we also call experiences red and green. So, when people use the word color, notoriously, a lot of times are talking past each other, because what they were. So you want to say, look, is this thing right here, the sweater I'm wearing, it's blue? Well, what does that mean? As opposed, so some people would say what it means is that it produces blue experiences in a perceiver. Whereas other people would say, no, the object itself has the property of being blue. And so the first kind of person would say, no, it only has that property in an attenuated sense, in the sense that it has the power to produce in a person like us the experience of blue. So the object itself literally doesn't have the color property. It's a mental thing. And so that's the way I tend to think about colors. But he was saying that was the wrong way to think about them. So yeah, I'm not sure exactly what the key idea was.
Yeah, I've always thought the idealist position is quite strange. Like the fundamentality, that terminology has always confused me. And the idea that there is that consciousness itself is inherent in electrons or something like the panpsychist view uh, seems as strange to me as saying that dark matter is in electrons. Like there's some feature that seems to be present in that very specific location right there in the universe, and we can't explain it. Therefore, we're going to say it's fundamental to all things in the universe, some part, and that seems very odd to me. It's like, why would we prefer that over saying it's just an emergent property of the stuff that's in that specific location, as far as we can tell? And
Yeah.
another question I have always thought about is why would saying it's fundamental to electrons be different from saying it's fundamental to brains? Or how would it be different to say it's emergent from brains to say it's fundamental to electrons? Wouldn't those be like synonymous, the same thing? Like you just change the word fundamental to emergent, and don't they become the same thing at that point?
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, I'm not an idealist, and I think panpsychism and idealism are different. Um, Certainly, I had Philip and Bernardo on at the same time on my channel a while back, and they seem to disagree with each other quite a bit. So they seem like different views, but I get what you mean, a kind of like general non-physicalist approach here. But so you know, I think the person who's one of the more interesting panpsychists is Galen Strawson, who actually was Philip's dissertation advisor. He's sort of one of the main guys here, and he taught at the graduate center where I went to grad school, and I had a couple classes with him. And I actually tried to invite him on my podcast, and he said no. We just disagree too much about stuff to have a discussion. I was like, well, all right. But I think that his arguments is that strong emergence in the sense that you're talking about just is kind of conceptually not understandable. Like so we can make sense of what's called weak emergence, where the properties of the macro level stuff is not obviously related to the micro level stuff. But if we knew more, then we would see how they're related. But that's weak emergentism on his way of thinking. Whereas strong emergentism is the idea that you get a new kind of property that's not related at all to the micro level. And there it does seem to me that you could credibly make the claim that it looks like magic, because you have like electrons, you have protons, you have strong nuclear force, you have weak nuclear force, you have hamada blah, then magic, red. So that's, now I'm not saying that that's a good argument, but I'm saying that's where they're coming from. So the idea, and you can get a kind of similar kind of the combination problem and all that stuff against panpsychism. I think those are serious things. But at least as I hear those guys, what they're saying is it's a problem in the same ballpark. How do you get experience from experience? Whereas on the other side, you're saying that you get experience just from out of the blue. And so there are some people, like John Searle, who, is not a great guy for various reasons, but was a decent philosopher. He liked to say, yeah, well, you just that's what happens. It's like digestion. It just pops out of a certain high level set of properties. But a lot of people, that just sounds like property dualism. Like if there is really no conceptual relationship between the conscious properties and the physical properties, then you can just sort of dig your heels in and say that's what happens. But if you want to try to understand why it happens, then there's where the problem, I think, really begins. So, and you may be fine with that. You may say, who fucking cares about understanding shit? Like, so that's just the way it is. But a lot of people are really attracted to this idea that if it is a certain way, then we should be able to understand why it's that way.
Yeah, that's where my
That on you.
question comes in, is that how does saying it's fundamental to electrons in any way provide more of an understanding than saying it's this strong emergent just pops out of existence like what was it, digestion or whatever? They seem to be equally as bad just equally as ad hoc, like saying it's fundamental to an electron versus saying it's emergent from a brain. Like why couldn't you just replace the word emergent with fundamental there? What's the difference between saying it's fundamental to an electron and saying it's fundamental to a brain that somehow makes the fundamental to electron a special kind of a claim?
It's well, I'm not sure I'm understanding your question, but and remember, I'm playing devil's advocate here. You always like to put me in these positions, and I know everyone's going to be like, "Oh, this fucking idiot's a panpsychist." So like, no, I'm actually not, but I am for taking arguments seriously and for trying to. I mean, that's and on my own podcast and my own thinking, what I like to do is try to understand why people who are smart would say these fucked up things. It's like I think that's a crazy thing to say, but but they're not stupid. I don't think these people are dumb in any way, shape,
Yeah,
or
I
form.
do the same thing. Like I did a debate where I was the Christian and the other guy was the atheist. So yeah, steel manning the other person's position is always important in learning how to argue and learning try to understand the other person's position is the best way to do it.
Exactly. Yeah, I agree. I think we've talked about that briefly before too, so I completely agree. But so then the difference would be, and remember, I might not be the best person to defend this view because I don't hold it, but difference would be that so what your starting ingredients are. So if your starting ingredients are things that are conscious already, then you can make sense of how consciousness would show up at some point because it's there already. Whereas if your starting ingredients are things which are not conscious, then it's harder to make sense of how you get it at the end. And it's a different kind of problem than, the compositional division fallacy, which I know that we spoke about before. But so there's no conceptual difficulty in understanding how a wall is built from bricks. But there does seem to be some conceptual difficulty in understanding how consciousness is built from non-consciousness. And so that's their, and so, yeah, you're right. They're positing that something is fundamental. So they're just helping themselves to the thing. But the payoff is that it allows you to understand how the end result gets to be the way that it is, because it's building parts. I mean, it's the same with the brick. Why is the brick physical? Well, because the parts are physical. So why are we conscious? Well, because the parts are conscious. So I think that's where you get the payoff.
Well, would that work the same way for any unknown, like say dark matter or dark energy, something we just can't understand conceptually or can't build it into our framework some way? Could we make the same argument and say, well, it's fundamental to everything, therefore that would explain why it's emergent and or why it shows up in that particular location?
I don't think so. I mean, well, we have added new things. I mean, the famous example is electromagnetism. So, electromagnetism was by all standards non-physical in the 19th century, because the whole idea of a field was, at least those kinds of fields anyway, didn't fit the standard definition of physicality, which would involve little things bumping into little corpuscles bumping into each other, and fields don't act that way. So we had to add something in as fundamental, namely this idea of a field. And now fields are the paradigm of the physical. So sometimes science does progress by adding fundamental things and the payoff is that you can explain more things in other domains. But I think that the big difference between consciousness and dark matter is that dark matter has some function. So it doesn't interact with light strongly, but it does interact with space. Gravitational effects are observable. So we can operationalize it in terms of that. It is that which causes this gravitational lensing effect. So we don't want to say it's fundamental perhaps at this point. I think the going hypothesis that it's a type of particle, although the acceptable kinds of particles are being narrowed because of all the failures of the particle colliders or whatever, or not failures, successes in ruling out various candidates. But the whole idea of the hard problem, which maybe some people don't like, but some people do. The whole idea of the hard problem is that consciousness isn't like that. There's no function which we can associate with consciousness, as evidenced by the fact that you can imagine all that stuff happening. That's the zombies and the Mary, all that sort of stuff, which you may be skeptical to begin with. But that's the whole point of that stuff, is to try to show that and even in the comparison with life doesn't work, because life is just the implementation of certain functions, namely reproducibility, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what the Elan Vital people, the vital force guys thought was that no physical thing could implement those functions. And then we found out, oh yeah, here's a way that physical things can implement. It's called fucking DNA. And they're like, oh, wonderful. But with consciousness, the whole hardness of the hard problem is that there's no thing which seems like functionally definitive for a conscious experience. As you know, so invert cases, your red is my blue or whatever. Zombie cases, you could have exactly the same behavior, absent. That's what all those kinds of things are supposed to be showing. And what makes the hard problem, the hardness of it, is that it doesn't have that functional profile, whereas dark matter does. So there'd be no reason, there's no hard problem of dark matter in that sense.
Oh yeah, absolutely, because it's we observe it in a scientific way, and so we can posit certain things that we already know about that could explain it. So a better analogy might be emergent space-time, or back when Einstein invented the curvature of space-time. Those things would seem equally as perplexing and logically impossible to many philosophers at the time. Would those be better analogies?
Well, again, so the reason why Einstein won that debate is because there were observable effects, which you could go and observe, and then they did. But there is no equivalent observational effect, which you can go and check out. And this, I mean, I think this is probably where this kind of disagreement bottoms out. And because I've watched, some of your debates with other people. By the way, I have a bone to pick with you about some shit you said about Hume, which we may get to later. Specifically the problem of induction. But so materialism, idealism, panpsychism, these are all empirically equivalent theses. There's no prediction that one makes that the other doesn't make. And I like your general take on this, which is a kind of optimistic meta induction, where you say, but in every other case, the physical stuff has won out. And so that we have more reason to believe that everything is physical than that we have to believe that there are these other special non-physical things. But I think that kind of ignores this whole business about the hard problem stuff, which is that their whole idea that consciousness is special and there's nothing else like it, in the sense that it's not functionally hooked up to the rest of the world in this way.
Yeah, I take all of those it's impossible kinds of arguments to be kinds of arguments from ignorance or arguments from incredulity. Anytime anyone says it's impossible that X, I see it as it's impossible for you to imagine that X. But I don't think it's ever a good argument to say it's impossible in reality that X. Like I even am on record granting that if you say there's a hypothesis of a round square and it makes testable predictions, I'm going to count that as evidence of a round square. So I think that any such it's impossible that arguments are always kinds of arguments from incredulity.
Yeah, but I don't see why that applies to this kind of case. And I don't think that the argument it's an impossible argument. It's the argument in its best form goes as follows: physics explains structure and function. Consciousness isn't a function or a functional or structural property. Therefore, physics can't explain it.
Wasn't that essentially? Couldn't you just rephrase that by saying it's impossible that physics could explain consciousness?
Well, I don't see why those are equivalent. So what it's saying is it's saying what physics does explain and what consciousness seems. I mean, so there are lots of functionalists who will deny that second premise, but it certainly seems at least that consciousness isn't a functional structural property. And so it's not saying that it's impossible for physics to explain. It's saying here's the sorts of things that physics explains. Here's the sort of thing that consciousness is. So conclusion is physics doesn't explain that. Now, for people like me who are, flat-footed identity theorists, I think the mind just is identical to the brain. We're going to say, who gives a fuck about explanation? I don't care. Like, who are you to say we need to explain everything? Some things are postulated because they explain other things. And so in certain modes, I don't even think that
You even need an
water
explanation.
being H2O is explained. I think that's something that we postulate to explain other things. But in other moods, I think, well, could you deduce that water was H2? I don't know. So I go back and forth on that. But ultimately, I think that this goes to the principle of sufficient reason, which, by the way, to connect it to the God stuff, I think is behind a lot of these really bad arguments for the existence of God, is that people just feel like we're entitled to know this shit. Like we're so, our reasoning abilities are so kick ass. Of course, we would understand why things are the way they are. And this goes all the way back to the ancient philosophy, the debate between Democritus and Aristotle. Democritus was an atomist in the old days who just said everything is random, things happen by chance, there's no good explanation. And Aristotle said, dude, we can't know. There's got to be some reason why things are the way they are. And Democritus said, no, fuck you, there just isn't, dude. It's randomness. So, but that's strikes at the core of our desire to understand things, right? Aristotle's famous phrase, all people by nature desire to know, isn't that one? And I think that's right. We do want to know. But sometimes I think the answer may just be there's nothing to know. And so when you want to know why water is H2O, then I think the answer is because it is. And that's it. So that the identity in that sense wouldn't be discovered. There's no explanation for why it is the way it is. It just is that way. It just bottoms out at that. Identities are brute in that sense. And the whole like Chalmers program is, he calls those strong necessities, and just thinks that that's if there's no explanation for why it is the way that it is, that's just too much for him to take. So I don't know, it's like it really elevates the status of human reasoning to this level, which I sometimes feel is like too high. But I still feel the pull of those intuitions. Like I would like to know, like it would be great if there was some like a priori connection that we could deduce that water was. I mean, that whole program is very enticing, but it's just not clear to me why we feel entitled for it to be. I mean, I don't know why we're entitled to feel that way because it's enticing to us, but I don't know what would make it really be the case that for every fact there's something that explains why that fact is the way it is.
Yeah. To go back to your point about how physics explains interactions of some kind, consciousness isn't an interaction.
No, it explains structure and function.
That's it. Structure and function. So physics explains structure and function. Consciousness isn't structure and function. Therefore, physics can't explain consciousness. I would say that would beg the question about the limits of physics. I'd say that physics, our current understanding of physics, you'd have to like put that caveat in first. Our current understanding of physics does X. And currently we can't do this regarding consciousness. And if you put those caveats in there, then it seems to weaken the argument. It seems like the argument they're making is much more deductive. It says physics can't ever do X. What consciousness is necessarily this way. Therefore, physics will never be able to explain this. Seems to be more the argument they're going for, which is why I think it is more of it's impossible kind of an argument rather than like an inductive thing of, well, physics can't do this yet.
You're talking to this. I mean, so Chalmers is very clear about this. Maybe other people are not as clear, but Chalmers is very clear. David, whatever else you think about David Chalmers, he's a serious thinker, like a very serious person who's very careful, actually. And people always attribute to them these other views, but he's actually, we can go back and read what he says. He's like caveats left and right. There's always like an out and an escape hatch, and so he's very serious that way, I think. But so he says, look, here's the argument. It's basically the one I just gave, which you can find in The Conscious Mind. And then he fleshes that out with zombies and Mary and inverse, but all those things are secondary to this explanatory argument, at least the way I read them. And so he says, look, if there was something, this is called type C physicalism in the way he puts things, the view that you just said. So type C physicalism, basically, so he has type A, type B, type C, type D, type E, type F. I mean, the whole fucking thing. So the type C move is to say, well, as it is right now, there's this explanatory gap and this, we can't do these explanations, but the physics of the future will be able to do it, perhaps. I find that move to be, I've made that move myself in a couple papers I wrote, so I'm not against that move. But the challenge for that sort of response is to say, what thing would be added to physics? So you have to say something about what it is that's going to be added to it. And if it's not going to be consciousness itself, then what sort of thing could you add that physics could explain? I mean, all that we've ever seen so far is structure and function. It looks like that's the job of physics, to explain how things react and what the structures they have and what jobs they do. And so, now someone like Daniel Stoljar says, well, maybe there are these properties which are not consciousness, but they're these non-structural, non-functional properties, which when added will allow you to give rise to consciousness or something like that. So you can make that move, but that's just a placeholder. And if anyone's doing that's a Hail Mary, I guess I would say, is like once you got to that point, having to introduce some like undiscovered, non-structural, non-functional property. Well, what is it? I don't know what it is, but it could be there. So that seems to me to give the other side exactly what they want, which is to say we can't do it now.
So Chalmers is making more of the inductive case is in his argument rather than the deductive one.
Well, I'm not sure. So, I mean, just to go through the standard menagerie here, there's the type A physicalist who says there's no problem at all. People who usually fly that banner are sometimes called analytic functionalists. So they say, look, you can't, all there is to having these properties is having certain sorts of behaviors, and you can tell right now what those are. So Dennis, the champion of that sort of view, thinks there's no hard problem and that it's a confusion and that, blah, blah, blah. So that's a view. It's not a very popular view, but you can have it. And it's actually, I think you can make more of it than people typically do, but that's another story. Then there's the type B physicalist who sort of says what I said before about the identities being brute, and there's no fact, no fact about why they are that way. They just are that way. Then there's the type C person who says, in the future someday neuroscience will figure this out. And then, the type D is the dualist, and type E is the epiphenomenalist, and type F is the Russellian monism. So you have all those energies. But the physicalist views, you just have those three camps, basically. You have the people who say there's no hard problem at all. We understand everything there is to know now. You have the people who say, well, these things are a posteriori, things we discovered, but they're necessary. And then the camp that says, well, it's going to be in the future. But the type C position threatens to collapse into one of the other two. So what's it going to be in the future? More functional or structural stuff? Well, then it's just type A, future type A.
For sure, in regards to the materialist, but I'm asking about the kinds of idealists. So my objection would be for a certain kinds of idealists, they say it's absolutely impossible that no matter what we discover in the future, no material thing will ever be able to explain consciousness. They're making a kind of deductive, it's impossible argument. And I think I would object to that and say that's an argument from incredulity. And then there could be another kind
is that no structural or functional property will ever explain consciousness.
What do you mean? Like, how does that relate? So would that not be an impossible kind of an argument?
Well, if it's so you have these two premises of the argument: physics explains structure and function. Consciousness is not functional or structural. Functional or structural, yeah. So physics doesn't explain it. So the argument's valid. So therefore, if it's sound, the conclusion follows. So the only way to avoid it is to deny one of the two premises. The first premise is that physics explains only structure and function. So you could deny that, which I thought was your original move, and say, well, no, there's some non-functional, non-structural property, which maybe we'll find out about in the future. So you could deny that, or you could deny the second.
I'm making a more general objection here. I'm saying that you have to include that as a possibility in any reasonable argument. You couldn't, if anybody doesn't include that possibility, I would call that an argument from ignorance or an argument from incredulity. If you don't include the possibility that there could just be something in science that we don't know yet that does explain it. So if you reject that entirely and you make this argument into an absolute claim that science cannot do that, like if the idealist says does not include that possibility, then I'd say that kind of an argument, if you're rejecting that possibility, is an argument from incredulity, saying it's impossible.
But no one's rejecting that possibility. It's just that. So what sort of thing are you envisioning would be found? Is it a structural or functional thing?
Oh, I'm not answering a specific hypothesis here at all. I'm just saying that if an idealist just made the assertion, it's impossible that anything in physics that we could ever discover in the future could ever explain consciousness. Anybody who made that argument, I would say that argument is fallacious. I don't like that argument.
Yeah, but that's the argument which I was just talking about, or that we were talking about previously.
Yeah. So
that your argument is a bad argument, but here's a different one. Physics explains structure and function. Consciousness is not a functional or structural property, so physics doesn't explain it. So there, no one's saying I never said the word impossible. I never said it wasn't possible. I just said, here's a fact about physics. Here's a fact about consciousness. There's a conclusion that follows. So you could deny one of those two premises. Like you could perfectly, like the type A physicalist is going to say, no, I deny the second premise. consciousness is a structural or functional property. That's why they think there's no hard problem and it's all an illusion or something like that. Or even the type B physicalist, like someone like me, is going to say, no, it is that sort. It's a structural property. It just doesn't seem like one. So there's a way out of it. But if you accept both of those premises, one, that physics explains structure and function, and two, that consciousness is not a structural or functional property, then the conclusion follows that physics doesn't explain it. Now, you could even, I think, have another move and say, well, why does physics need to explain it? Why do we need an explanation? But that's so you can do those things, but no one is saying the thing you're saying, which is that, oh, it's impossible for physics to explain it. They're saying this other thing, which is here's what physics explains. Here's what consciousness is. There's something that follows from that.
Oh yeah, that's fair enough, because a lot of the idealists I've talked with have actually literally said that it's impossible. They've said that multiple times in many of my debates. So that's usually.
But I think, but what they, so I don't know these guys. I mean, I think I saw one discussion with EJ Green. Is that who you're maybe referencing, or is that what his name was? I don't know. Some idealist that was on your show.
I've had about a dozen of them, so I don't think that was the one. Emerson Green? No.
Oh yeah, is that who it was? Okay, yeah. Sorry, I'm bad with names and faces and everything else. So I think when they say that, what they mean is this thing that I'm saying. So the reason why they think it's impossible for physics to explain it is because they think physics explains a certain kind of thing and consciousness isn't that kind of thing. And to put that way, the argument's not ridiculous. It may be unsound. Certainly, I think it's unsound. I'm not a dualist or idealist, so I think the argument's unsound. But it's a valid argument. It's not a ridiculous argument, and it isn't like an argument from incredulity or something like that. If you think the first premise is false, then you think there are some kind of non-structural, non-functional property. Sometimes, I mean, the Russellian monism shit that people like Philip Goff are defending. You don't have to have a consciousness be the thing that you put there. Some people, there's a philosopher at the University of New York. Her name's Barbara Montero, and she argues that there's this kind of non-structural, non-functional property, which is just a physical property, and that gives rise to consciousness. So you can make that move. Of course, it's hard to understand like what that property would be and how it's connected to consciousness, but that's a different question. So I don't think that's a kind of argument from incredulity. I just think that many physicists think that the job of physics to explain structural and functional properties, and many people believe that consciousness isn't that kind of property. And so the conclusion is, well, it's not a physical property or something like that. But there's no incredulity there.
So my interpretation of that is like if I have a magic 8-ball and I shake it and it gives me the right answer to any mathematical problem I give it, like ask it some mathematical problem and I shake it, it gives me the right answer every single time. And then somebody comes along and says, well, it gets all the math answers right, but it doesn't apply to history. You can't apply it to history at all because it only gives numbers or whatever. And my response would be, wait a minute, the fact that it hasn't given us letters yet doesn't mean it can't give us letters yet. So your argument seems to be just based off of, well, the fact it doesn't do it yet means it can't do it.
Yeah, but that's not what the argument is. It's not my argument, by the way, first of all. But this argument, which is under consideration, doesn't do that.
So is all that it's claiming is that it doesn't do it yet? And that's just the extent of the argument. It just assumes it can't, like all swans are white. It's probably they're all going to be white in the future kind of a thing?
It's not an inductive argument. It's a deductive argument. So if the conclusion follows, it follows necessarily. But, look, so deductive arguments can be valid, but still unsound. And if they're unsound, that just means one of the premises is false and you have to accept the conclusion then. So what you're saying, it's hard to interpret what you're saying, but one way of interpreting what you're saying is that, well, one of the premises is false. And that's perfectly fine. But the way in which the premise would have to be false, you'd have to say which premise is false and for what reason. So you could say the first premise is false because there are non-structural, non-functional properties.
Well, do I? So for example, take the space-time argument against Einstein. Space isn't an object. Space isn't a physical object. It can't bend. Einstein's object has space-time bending and Einstein is false, something like that. There's some deductive argument that space-time isn't a physical thing, so it can't physically bend. I mean, I don't have to argue that the argument is wrong. I just say that's a nice argument. You're claiming it's impossible. I just think any time you make those kinds of deductive arguments, it's always an argument from incredulity. I'm going to wait for more evidence. You don't actually need to pick one of the premises and try to explain why it's wrong and present the hypothesis. You can just say that anytime you claim a deductive argument like that, I'm going to say it doesn't apply to reality. It's just your imagination. For any deductive argument, I think the only ones that can really be applied to reality are more inductive for the most part.
Well, no, you would. I mean, I guess, yeah. So, you. So I don't know why you keep calling an argument from incredulity, because that means something specific and it's not going on here. That means I can't see how this could be true, therefore it's not. That's not the move that's going on here. And even in the argument you gave about Einstein, I mean, I think one of the premises there is that can be questioned is that space doesn't have these properties. And,
oh yeah, absolutely. So
certainly everybody was within rights to reject Einstein's view before it was empirically confirmed. So I get what you're saying about that. The empirical confirmation ruled out all those Bergson or whatever that guy's, this.
But they thought it was completely impossible. Or they presented it in a deductive form in the same way that you're presenting the idealist argument in a deductive form. And
it's not an inductive argument.
Deductive, in a deductive form. So if they're presented in a deductive form, which means if both of the premises are true, the conclusion follows necessarily, then because we now know in hindsight that it's false, what was wrong with the argument was that wasn't representing reality, that was just representing their imagination. They imagined space-time to have these properties, and they couldn't imagine it not having these properties, therefore they thought this. Which seems to me...
One of the premises was false.
Yeah.
Deductive argument... So this is another background disagreement I think we had, because I think deductive arguments count as evidence. In a way that you don't. In fact, I think that's kind of the philosophical method, is treating arguments as evidence. But that we could argue about that later. But on what you just basically said was, here was an argument, there was a conclusion, and we found out one of the premises was false. So if we hadn't found out one of the premises was false, we'd still have good reason to believe the conclusion.
So yeah, I would reject that. I would say that the way the argument was formed was itself inherently wrong. I would say the correct way to form the argument would be, right now we think of space-time like this. And if we think of space-time like this, then it has these properties. So I can't understand how it would be Einstein is correct. That would be the correct way to phrase the argument. Putting it in a deductive form like space-time cannot have this property or whatever, seems to be an overextension of like what you said before, of claiming that we have this absolute knowledge of the universe, this fundamental tying it in. I think that any claims of those kinds of absolutes fit into that category, and I don't like them for the same reason you don't like those super claims, the PSR kind of claims. And so I think that any of those kinds of claims are overextensions, and they should always have that caveat at the beginning to make them kind of an inductive claim, and then that solves the problem. So my problem is with those kinds of deductive arguments that say this must be this way. I don't think you should ever say that, ever, in any case.
But no one did in this argument we were talking about. So, and I don't even think it did in the kind of argument you were talking about a second ago. Space has this kind of property, blah, blah, blah. Time doesn't bend or whatever, space doesn't bend. I don't think there was any claim about how it must be that way. It was just a statement about the way space is. Turns out to be false. So too, in this argument, there's a claim about what physics does. Maybe that'll turn out to be false. Maybe physics does more than that. There's a claim about what consciousness is. Maybe that's false. But I don't think you need to get rid of all deductive arguments simply because sometimes deductive arguments have false premises. And I don't think that you have to interpret the deductive argument as saying it must be this way, except for insofar as maybe what you have a problem with all deductive arguments giving us knowledge about reality. So that would be like a very Humean line, in which, it's a respectable tradition saying,
oh yeah, for sure. Deductive arguments for conceptual stuff like math and logic, I'm happy with. I'm fine with those. It's just only when it's applied to the external reality thing that I have an issue with.
Yeah, but I don't really see why. So if I say, you know, all human beings are mortal. Tom Jump is a human being, therefore Tom Jump is mortal. That's a deductive argument. The conclusion follows with necessity. I believe that the premises are true, so therefore I have good reason to believe that the conclusion is true. And what's wrong with that?
Well, human beings aren't always going to be mortal, I think would be the problem. The first premise is false, most
Well,
likely.
so it's possible that the first premise is false, but if it isn't, then the conclusion follows necessarily. And I don't know what reason you think the first premise is false, but I mean, I can imagine, in the future, maybe we'll be immortal or something like that.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly you don't think Tupac is hanging out with Elvis or something like that, right? Hopefully.
On Mars, definitely for sure. But
Yeah.
but I would say that it would always, in every single case, be better to form the argument as an inductive. All humans we know about are immortal. Tom is immortal, therefore Tom is most likely mortal.
But why think that though?
Well, because of that exact reason. The deductive part to the argument seems to be universal, applying to all time and space forever, which seems to not work. That's like one of those PSR claims that we have sub-fundamental access to the fundamental nature of reality, which I think is wrong. So any of those claims, I think we should just always make them the as far as we know, and get rid of the all humans are kind of a claim, because I think those are bad, because they're probably all going to be wrong for the most part. Like probably humans will be immortal at one point.
But then that just means the premise is false, and you change the premise. So I don't know why you abandon deductive reasoning. I mean, so if suppose I remember the old days, we used to go places. Suppose I think, oh well, my class starts at 8:15. If I want to be there on time, I should leave now. Therefore, I should leave now. It's a perfectly good deductive argument, perfectly valid. Gives me a reason to believe I should leave now. I don't have to be like, well, all times my class in the past that started have been at 8:15, so maybe it's going to start at 8:15 today. If it's, you don't have, why should we jump through all those hoops? Now I grant what you're saying. We don't have perfect access to what's true, and in fact, that's the big flaw with deductive arguments, as you're I think correctly pointing out, that if you put things in and assume that they're true, then you can. And I mean, I just think that's most of the things that we know about is like conditional knowledge. Like if this is true, then the other thing will be true. I think that's a large part of what we actually do know. And we should have some humility and recognize that, yeah, the conclusion, I mean, the premises may in fact not be true. So that we shouldn't assume that we know which things are true, especially when it comes to these tricky issues. But it's still an advance to say, if these two things are true, then this other thing will be true. And then so there's a question about whether those things are true or not. But so I don't feel the force to throw away all deductive reasoning. I don't think it's the same as PSR sort of reasoning. Unless what you're saying is, why should we think that these, which is a real problem, by the way, why should we think that these valid inference forms are the right ones or something like that? I mean, that's.
Yeah, essentially we're just saying like one of those premises could be false in every of those cases. So any deductive argument, one of the premises could be false, and just leave it at that. I don't think we'd actually need to say which one or give a theory to which one. You could just say, one of those could be false. Any deductive argument, because we don't have perfect knowledge. So why would you assume that argument in itself is somehow evidence, because we don't have perfect knowledge? Why would that argument count as evidence?
Still, because, well, I guess, so it depends on what you think the goal of logic is. So, some people will interpret it one way. There's a whole big debate about what the point of logic is. But one way of thinking about it is it's a psychological theory about what one should believe. So if one believes if one believes the two things that I said, then one should also believe that physics doesn't explain consciousness. So there are lots of people who come to this and go, well, I believe these two things, but I'm a physicalist. And then, no, you can't do that. You can't say, yes, I accept that physics only does this. I accept that consciousness isn't like that, but I deny the conclusion. So it's a way of modeling internal consistency. And then you may read it and go, wait, I certainly believe that consciousness is physical. So, I got to figure out which of these two things up here I reject. Like which one consciousness must really be a functional property. It just doesn't seem that way. Or maybe there are non-structural properties that physics will have to include someday. So as a psychological tool, I think it's important. If you back up one step and say, look, this doesn't tell you what's true, but tells you what you should believe on the basis of other things.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with that.
Deductive reasoning is perfectly fine.
Oh, for sure. I absolutely agree with all of that. But I would say that when we're saying, is that evidence, does that indicate the conclusion is more likely or increase the probability it's true rather than false? I'd say, well, no, you're just modeling your own internal beliefs there. Like, okay, But does that presenting that argument itself move the like evidence or move the probability more towards the true side? No, it's just modeling your internal beliefs that are already there. The argument itself doesn't do anything.
Yeah, but here I think you're using the word evidence in a strange way because, and I know that you have this way of using it, which, it's fine. You can define it however you want, but I don't think that most people, well, I shouldn't say that. Certainly when I use the word evidence, I don't mean objectively makes things more likely to be true. But because evidence, you can have evidence for things that are false. And so evidence is more about what I should believe, not about what actually is true. And so if I have evidence for something, that means I should believe it. If I have evidence against something, that means I shouldn't believe it. But evidence and truth are two different things. Truth is a metaphysical property. Evidence is an epistemic property. So they come apart from each other. So when I say that something is evidence, what I mean is that that a person should believe it or not, or have reasons for believing it as opposed to not believing it.
So I think I partially agree with that. So I'd say that, yeah, for sure, truth, we don't, numinal truth, we don't have access to that. So when I say it's more likely to be true, what I mean is that we have good reasons to believe it's true or something like that. More reasons to believe it's true than not true, if you want to put it into the epistemic foundation thing. And I'm fine with that, but I'd say that the argument you presented, the deductive argument, doesn't give us more reason to believe it's true. Like the reasons were already there. The premises, you already believed them. This argument that you've presented is just articulating the beliefs you already had. The argument itself doesn't provide any extra reason you should believe it's true. It's just describing your already present beliefs.
Well, it's doing more than that because it's saying there's a connection between them, which guarantee that the conclusion is true. So if the premises of that argument are true, the conclusion is. So if you look at that argument and say, well, I don't know which of these premises I disagree with, but fuck that conclusion, I don't accept, then I don't think that's a rational response. Because you would have to have some reason to think that the premises are false, that one or more of them are false. And if you just say, well, it's a deductive argument and we could always be wrong, then I don't think that's really a good reason for rejecting the conclusion.
Right, but
So that's why I say, you can go one way, you could reject this conclusion, reject that one. I know people that reject both. I'm more liable to reject the second. But if your attitude is just, well, one of them's got to be wrong, but I don't know which one or why, that seems to me to be a not great position to be in.
well, I think I'd be going at it from the other way. I'd say that you would need reasons to think both of the premises are true first. Like I could just give you a random premise: cats are dogs, dogs are chickens, therefore cats are chickens, or whatever. Now that argument on its own is nothing. That does not provide any evidence to lead us to the conclusion that cats are chickens.
So just that the premise is false.
Right. So I'd say that what I would call evidence would be something to support the truth of the premises, not just the structure of the argument itself. I wouldn't count that as evidence. I'd say if you had something to support the truth of the premises, that's what I would count as evidence. So I don't just count the validity as evidence.
Right. So in the case that we were just talking about, there's independent reasons to think the two premises are true.
Right, and I'm happy with that part. But my objection would be just the argument itself, just the deductive argument itself. I wouldn't count as evidence. Just the validity, I don't count as evidence. I want to know the reasons why you think the premises are true. That's what I count as evidence, and that's why I reject the deductive argument itself, because I don't think it's just formulating your position. I want to know about the reasons behind the position.
I'm not sure if we agree with each other or not, because if P then Q, P therefore Q is not evidence for anything. That's just an argument schema, argument form, but it doesn't give you evidence for anything. But if dogs are cats, dogs are cats. Well, if dogs are cats, then chickens rule the moon. Dogs are cats, so chickens rule the moon. There, you do have some reason to believe the conclusion if you have reason to believe the two premises. Of course, we don't, because we can show, well, actually, it's if dogs are cats and chickens rule the moon turns out to be a true sentence according to propositional logic, unfortunately, but sadly, but true. But the second premise, certainly, we have reasons to believe is false. Dogs are cats, right? Conditional statements in logic often people get pissed off about. I always tell my students, here's a perfectly good sentence. If I'm on LSD, then I'm a great teacher. And they're like, that sentence false. I'm like, actually, it's a true sentence. Just because I'm not on LSD. if I were, that's a different story. But anyway, so conditional statements are weird in that way. But the second premise is clearly false, that dogs are cats. So since we believe that that's false, then we don't have a reason to accept the conclusion. But I think the two things work together. So the validity of the argument plus the premises being true give us reason to believe the conclusion. And I haven't seen any, I mean, I haven't heard you say any reason to think that any of these premises in that argument are false. What I've heard you say instead was it's always bad to give an argument like this. But you haven't said, well, I think that there's a non-structural, non-functional property that physics talks about. Or you haven't said consciousness really is a structural or functional property, even though it doesn't seem that way. But those are the sorts of things which you would, that's where you would have to focus your attack in order to undermine the argument. In other words, to undermine the kind of evidentiary claim.
Yeah, I think in my objection is going more of the way I've been going here. I'm saying that you need to provide evidence that the first two premises are actually true. And since many of the idealists I talk to say it's impossible that consciousness can be explained physically, and I call that an argument from incredulity, what I'm saying is you've provided no evidence. You've just asserted that, essentially. And
yeah, but the way I was putting the argument, there is evidence for it.
Right.
So all of the history of physics indicates that the job of physics is to explain structural and functional properties. The second premise, that consciousness is not a structural or functional property, can be illustrated by things like invert cases, your red being my blue, and stuff like that. So those are the reasons that people accept those kinds of premises. So, I mean, yeah, you would have to get into that, why they think it's true. That's where the real action, I agree with you completely. That's where the real action would take place. But I thought you were objecting to the very idea that this kind of argument would count as evidence for anything. But really what you're objecting to is that the premises don't seem to be true.
Right.
Which is standard.
Yeah, for sure. And that is because most of the times I talk to idealists, they're always using the word impossible. It's a very common theme. So that specifically is the kind of thing, because when they say it's impossible, the burden of proof for that is pretty enormous. But yeah, the kind that you present, I would say would be a much more carefully formulated argument. And I would, I just start asking questions about what does it mean to be a physical thing? How do you determine it is or isn't? What is, are there non-physical things we don't know about yet? But yeah, so for sure, I would agree with pretty much all of that for sure.
But the structural functional bit. So I mean, so do you think that consciousness is a structural and functional property? I mean, I assume you have to think that.
Well, I don't know what you mean by structural and functional. So what does that mean?
Well, just function is loosely defined as what an object does, what causal effect it has, what impact it has on other things, and structural properties are like properties. I mean, for the purposes that we're talking about here, would be things like brain structures, neurons and their interconnections and things of that nature.
So would that apply to like emergent spacetime, things that exist outside of spacetime? Because those, I don't know. Would that count as structural, functional?
Yes. If physics can describe what it does, then that's a structural functional property. I mean, if it can be mathematized, I mean, one way of loosely talking about structural functional properties is saying that it can be mathematically expressed. And certainly those kinds of, I'm a big fan of emergent space-time, by the way. I think physics is moving in that direction for sure. But I love string theory. I mean, people beat up on it, but I think it's an unfair rap. You
just like the idea that there's infinitely many U's out there, right?
Well, it's not clear that the multiverse is a direct implication of string theory, but there's like 3 or 4 steps that you have to go from there to the multiverse. One of them being eternal inflation, and there doesn't seem to be a mechanism for stopping it. So once it starts, it would just kind of go on and on. But yeah, I don't really like the idea of infinite me's. Anyway, so that's a different story. But if space-time, if it was emergent, it emerges from something structural and functional, but just that isn't space-time.
So what you're saying, something is structural and functional if it can be described mathematically.
Yeah.
But mathematical.
I said, yeah.
What?
That's a shorthand. It's a shortcut.
Yeah, I don't do well with remembering verbatim things. I'll do my best though. So, but since mathematical representations are just purely descriptive, I would say consciousness probably can be described mathematically. So I would probably put that in the structural functional category too. Right.
So that would be a way of denying the second premise of the kind of argument we were talking about by saying that consciousness is not a structural functional property. But the reason why people think that it is is because of zombies and Mary and things of that nature. You know, the Mary argument is supposed to be like a really clear way of distilling what the issue is. She knows all the structural functional properties, but she still learns something new when she sees red. So therefore, whatever it is that she learned when she saw red wasn't something that was knowable by her in the room. Now, I think there's all sorts of moves you can make there. I know your map territory thing kind of responds to that, although I don't know if that, I wouldn't endorse that response. That doesn't mean it's wrong or anything, but I think the kind of issue with that sort of response is that if you really think that she could know all the structural and functional properties in her room, then she should know what it's like to see red without ever having experienced it, because it's just another structural functional property. She should be able to learn it in the same way that she learns like what triangularity is. I can know what triangularity is in its essence by just learning all the structural and functional properties about triangles. Remember, knowing the equations and what shapes that you can form from them and so forth and so on. Mary could know everything about that in her room without ever having seen anything that was triangular. But it seems hard to see how she could do that with red. Now, people like Dan Dennett say, "Oh yeah, well she can." That's, you know, you don't know what it is to have that kind of property. And so there certainly, you can make that move. Many people find it unconvincing. I myself would count myself as one who finds that move unconvincing, because I think she has to have the experience to get the concept of it. And then after that, I think, well, maybe she could make those kinds of deductions. But that's the difference. That's the thing that's why those kind of arguments come up in the first place, is because what they're trying to do is really bolster that second premise.
Well, do you think that you could know, in the sense like a mathematical model, you could know something about a particle, but that knowledge is somehow different than, for example, the actual interaction going on? The representation of the language, even though you know it, is separate from the thing itself, right? But you could still,
of course, but there you wouldn't learn anything new. So if all you knew were like the completed physics of the universe, and someone said, "Here's a particle, it's going to interact with this particle," and you wrote down all the equations, and then you went and saw the particle, you wouldn't learn. You would, yep, it did exactly what the equation said. There would be no surprises. You wouldn't be like, "Oh, there's this, it did what? That's not what the equation said." There would be nothing like that.
well,
But in the very case, there is a surprise.
I'm going a step further. So even if I know all of the mathematical models of the world, that's still, since it's coming into me through the form of my consciousness or whatever, I can never know the numinal, the Kant's numinal, the thing in and of itself kind of a feeling, right? So even though I know everything about the universe, its physics, I'm still missing that numinal piece, right? I still can't get that. Or would that, is there a difference between that kind of an argument and the kind that the Mary's room is making? Because it seems like it's the same to me. It seems like,
well, if the property that you were talking about can be described mathematically, then she could know about it. Why couldn't she?
well, I'd still say it would probably fall into the category of the numinal realm and constant.
Well, then she couldn't know everything. She can't mathematize that property. I mean, the numinal realm is notoriously unmathematizable. That's the whole point of it, is that it's not something that can be described in any way. Kant gets into big trouble even talking about the noumena stuff, because it's like, well, I think it's a bit contradictory. He says it causes our experience, but it's not a cause, but it's outside of our experience, but it's not outside, but it's an object, but it's not an object. So the whole point of the noumena stuff is that there's no way to describe it. And so what you said earlier was that you thought that the property could be mathematically described, in which case Mary could know it. But now what you're saying is that she can describe it in a way that doesn't allow her to know it, which seems a bit strange.
So why would there be a problem with that? So I can describe how an electron works, but I can never see an electron, but I can still know how the electron works. So
right, and you thereby know everything about the electron. There's nothing left out of that, unless you think that there are non-structural and functional properties, and that's the thing we were talking about earlier. So if you think there is this other thing, the real electron, which is not describable by math in any way, all you can do is describe what that thing does. That's the kind of Philip Goff move. And then he says, and then what that thing is consciousness. And the Barbara Montero move is to say, well, that thing is not consciousness, but it's a physical thing. But they both agree that whatever it is, it's not something that can be mathematically captured. All that you can capture is what it does, the way it interacts with things. But what it is in itself can't be captured in those terms. And if that's what you mean, yeah, that's fine. But that's a different way out of the puzzle.
Well, yeah, because I don't think our physics can describe everything. I think our physics is very limited. It's a very novel kind of a thing in human history. I don't think it has the capability to describe absolutely everything, but I think the things there are physical things, even though we don't know how to describe them yet.
Well, it depends on what. So we haven't got a completed physics of. I agree. Like so we should all agree that we don't have a completed physics. Um, but even so, we can just. I mean, what can we not describe? I mean,
The essence of an electron, like what energy actually is, what it's made of.
yeah, exactly. So that's the sort of thing which is not a structural or functional property, and physics isn't in the job of describing those things. That's the first premise of the argument we were talking about earlier. The physics explains structural or functional properties. It doesn't explain essential properties or these kinds of, some people call them inscrutables or quiddities or thisness, or you can make up all kinds of stupid fucking words. But the point is that if there's something there which is not essentially a functional or structural property, then physics is not in the job of describing that.
Okay, so yeah, that helps clarify a lot because from when I think of structural functional, I'm thinking of the ontology, the thisness of it as being one of those things. So if you're separating those two things and saying the structural functional bit is just the descriptions of its interactions and it doesn't include its essence or its ontology, that makes more sense. I could agree with that for sure. I'd say that our physics just describes the interactions. It doesn't describe the thisness for sure.
Yeah, exactly.
And so when you're saying there's
this, and then the question is, what is the thisness? So there are some people, the guys that are on my side, like James Ladyman, who say that's it. That's what's called ontic structural realism. That's all there is, right? So there's no thisness there at all. It's just relations all the way down. And that's all there is to reality, is just those interactions. So and some people don't like that. I know Philip Goff, he hates that view. I love it. I personally think it's probably true. But for people who don't like it, then if you want to add some like thisness there, then the question is, what is it? So the Goff types say, well, what it is consciousness. And the Monteros of the world say, well, what it, and also Daniel Stoljar, who I mentioned also previously in one of his, I think he kind of originally coined this idea. But anyway, so he says, no, it's a physical property. And then you can get into this other weird category of proto-phenomenal. I don't even know what the fuck those things are. But so if you want to add one, so it could be just another physical property. But then you get, I mean, if that's the way you go, and it's a perfectly respectable thing to say it's not consciousness, it's physical, then I still think that in spirit, the dualist has won for the following reasons, because there is a property that we don't understand, and physics can't describe it, and yet it's somehow crucial for giving rise to consciousness. Whereas for me, I want to say it's just brain activity, and who cares what the intrinsic nature of it is. I don't really think that the kind of physicalism that I want to be true doesn't postulate these mysterious things that are hidden, which can't be described mathematically. I want it to be just like water. There's no question about H2O and water. They're structural properties. Water is a structural property. H2O is a structural property. They turn out to be the same property. And who cares about all this hidden essence shit? I don't think. I think that if you have to postulate something like that, then yeah, they win.
Well, how so?
A moral victory, not maybe an ontological victory, but they win a moral victory.
Well, put it in the context of like an electron. Like in physics, can't describe whatever everything is made of. It just kind of says energy, and it's there. We don't know what energy is. It's just energy. But I wouldn't say that's a victory for the dualist, because I'd say it's still just a physical thing. We just don't know how to describe it with physics, because physics just describes the interaction. So if there's just one object there, physics obviously can't describe it.
But why think it's a physical thing at that point?
Turtles all the way down. Physics. This is physical stuff. So whatever it's made of is probably other physical stuff.
Well, I mean, so what I would say is we know exactly what energy is. It's the stuff it's this causal relationship. It's the stuff that accelerates and that you can store and blah, blah, blah. So it's just those things. And what is mass? We know exactly what mass is. It resists acceleration. It bends space-time. And so you just give a bunch of structural descriptions and functional descriptions, and then that's it. You're done. It's like, that's what energy and mass are.
Well, I would
relationally.
I would have an issue with that. So I'd say that like, imagine if there was no particles. Space-time is still there, but there's no way to measure it. There's no way to measure gravity. but it's still there. Like there's still space-time is a thing that still exists there. We just can't measure it. So I'd say that whatever this fundamental thing is, it's there. We just can't measure it because it doesn't show any interactions. There's nothing for it to interact with. It is the thing. And so if physics is can only describe changes and interactions of some kind, if there is one essential thing and it doesn't have any interactions, then physics obviously can't describe it. But it's still there, just like gravity's still there, even if there are no particles. So couldn't we still say that space-time is a thing there, even if we couldn't describe it with physics? Would that make it a new kind of thing just because we don't have the ability to describe the interactions because it doesn't have any?
Well, no, in that case, it would still be counterfactually the case that if there were mass around, it would bend that space-time. I mean, so it still has all those structural properties, even if they're not being enacted. So those properties are still properties of it, and a completed physics of even an empty space. Although, just to throw in a wrinkle here, there are some people who claim that space exists only when there are objects. So that's a different. The assumption that space would exist even if there are no objects is already a substantial claim, which some people would deny. Certainly, that's what Newton thought, but lots of people think Newton was wrong, like Leibniz for one, but many other people as well. But anyway, so no one cares about that shit. But what space is a substantial question. So the answer that modern physics gives is what space is. It's the thing which responds in various ways to mass and energy. And it would be that way even if there were no mass around. It would still have those properties. So that would be just, the equations would still be true of it.
Oh yeah, for sure, definitely. But that would seem to be the point, is that the fact it is still there even if we couldn't describe it with our numbers yet. So it's there even though we can't describe it yet. So we could say the same thing about an electron. It has some kind of essence there that if we find a way to poke it, we're going to be able to make math and describe it. We just can't yet.
Well, so then there may be some, functional structural property which we don't know how to poke, as you put it, which is fine. But you got to make up your mind about which way you want to go. Maybe not you, but one should make up their mind whether what one is saying is that there are properties which are essences and therefore not structural or functional, or whether one is saying that there is some structural or functional property which we just don't know how to quantify yet, but could in the future. Whereas the kinds of things that we were talking about before, they can't be quantified they can't. They resist all attempts at this a mathematical description. You can describe what they do, but you can't describe themselves in that way. And whereas what sounded like you were saying just a second ago was, well, maybe we'll find out a way to describe them, in which case then they wouldn't be those kind of intrinsic properties, which, could exist even if they didn't. Think about, and this is something these guys like to say. So take the electron. Suppose that there is some hidden essence to the electron that's more than just its causal interactions, but this essential quiddity or thisness or whatever. Then you could imagine that thing existing by having all the properties of the proton. In other words, interacting with matter in the way that protons do, rather than the way electrons do, being repelled by other kinds and being attracted to. So you just switch all the swap. I try to say swatch and switch at the same time. Swap and switch. Just change.
Swatch.
Permutate all of the fundamental properties and keep all of the interactions the same. That kind of an inversion at the quiddity level. So I don't know. So could an electron be a proton? Well, yeah, on that view, it could. If the causal interactions were different, but the thing itself were the same, then the essential essence of the electron could turn out to be a quark, or it could turn out to be a neutron. Whereas, people like me want to say, no. What it is to be an electron is to have these causal interactions. So anything else that did that would just be an electron. Doesn't make sense on my way of thinking to take the essential thing and go, aha, here's an electron. Now let's make it do the proton stuff. Because if it did the proton stuff, it would be a proton, because that's what being a proton is simply interacting with things in that way, following these descriptions and so forth and so on.
I think I would disagree with that. I think that we would label it as a proton, but I think if it does have some kind of an essence that it's made of and it just interacts in some way that makes it seem like a proton, it would still have that essence, which would make it different kind of identity, law of identity, to have some new property there, uh, even if the interactions it has with space-time would be identical with some other thing that has the same interactions.
Well, then, so by your view, then we could be studying protons for all we know when we look at electrons, and we would never know.
Well, I'd say that protons are just a label that we use to just mean the interactions, but that doesn't mean there isn't some essence behind them. And I think there is some essence of actual material stuff there that is not just the relations. And I think physics
Yeah, but
just
why think that though?
uh, why think that stuff exists?
Stuff, why think more than the relations exist?
It's hard for me to imagine relations
Ah,
existing.
incredulity.
Yes.
So I reject that argument. Imagine better. It's easy.
So
So
yeah,
arguments from that's exactly the argument from incredulity, though. It's like I can't picture it, so therefore I don't believe it. That's not a good argument.
yeah. I mean, I would say that there seems to be stuff here, and there seems to be stuff there, and everywhere we look, it seems to be stuff. So there's probably
Yeah,
some
and
essence of
by what
stuff.
you mean by that is the interactions of things. What you observe are the interactions. I mean, so you observe the repelling of the forces, the attraction of the forces, the lensing of the light, etc. But no one ever observes the hidden essences. Um, there's a book. I mean, if you're interested in this stuff, you should read just for your own personal curiosity. Maybe you've already seen this book, but it's called "Everything Must Go" by Ladyman. Ladyman and Ross, actually, I think it's a joint effort on their part. But basically, they make the arguments for structural realism, saying that all things, in the sense that you're talking about, have been shown to not exist by quantum physics, and that every person of your bent and variety is stuck in a pre-quantum frame of mind that's Newtonian and been falsified by science. Now, I'm not saying they're right, but I think they make a very strong case for thinking that this is a good thing.
Yeah, yeah. So I think my argument would be that, as I said before, that space time, if there was nothing to bend it, it would still be there. So there has to be some essence of it there. If it was just interactions or just relations, and there was nothing to interact with it, then it couldn't exist.
Yeah. So then I guess why wouldn't it exist? I mean, why would it exist in that case? Because you think it should? I mean, that doesn't. So
Why would it exist?
yeah, what reason is there to think that space would exist if independent of any stuff interacting with it? Unless you think what I said, which is that if there were things interacting with it, it would behave in the following ways, which is a perfectly respectable thing, I think. But
How would that be different? So, because if if you took it the other way and said if there were no things to interact with it, we could still describe it with these particular mathematics. That would be false. You wouldn't, because if there were no things to interact with it, it couldn't exist to potentially have a counterfactual way to describe it, right? Because if it's just the relation and it doesn't actually exist to have anything, or there isn't anything there to interact with it, then could it be said that you could counterfactually describe it with some kind of mathematics accurately? Does that make sense?
yeah, I see what you're saying, because if there were no way to ever test it, then what reason would we have to believe that I had that property or something like that? There were no things around for it to interact with, then how? I mean, I don't know. So if you have a vase and you say the vase is fragile, but the vase is never knocked over and therefore never breaks, is it still true that it's fragile? I would say yes, because what that means is that if it were knocked over, it would break. But it sounds like, according to your view, it's not fragile, because if it never broke, there's no reason. I mean, it didn't interact in that way or whatever, blah, blah, blah.
Well, no, I would agree with your approach. So I would say that, but for the statement to be true, that if it falls, it will break, and therefore it's fragile, that it must exist. It can't just be relations, can it? Because if it's just the relations and it never falls, then it has no relations. It doesn't have a relation with the floor because it's never fallen. So it seems like for it to make sense, there has to be a vase there that exists. The thisness has to be there, not just the
Well,
relations.
no, it has to exist. You're right. But the thisness doesn't need to be there. What needs to be there are the various counterfactual relations.
I'm not sure I'm following the difference there because for me,
But so, I mean, it's not really that important from my point of view, because I would be perfectly happy saying that in the case that you're envisioning, there is no space.
In the
And
case,
I don't
so
think that you've really given any reason to think that there would be space in such a scenario.
yeah, I would say that it seems more likely that the thing exists even if nothing's interacting with it, rather
But
than it
why?
doesn't exist.
I mean, that like so, take your standard quantum double slit experiment. So you have the two slits, you're shining some light at it. You're not measuring the light. So is it a wave or a particle? One way of interpreting the physics is it's neither. It's in a superposition state. There's no classical fact of the matter about which of those two things that it is. But now what you're saying is, well, it just seems more reasonable that it should be in one or the other of those two states. But why think that that's true? It's in one of the, if we look, we'll find it in one or the other of those two states. But there's no reason to think. In fact, some people think you can demonstrably show that it's not in either of those two states pre-observation.
I'm not sure.
Pre-measurement, I guess to be neutral, pre-measurement.
Yeah, for sure. I'm not sure follow the connection to my analogy. I'm struggling with that right now.
Well, because in this case, it's neither a wave nor a particle, but it's intuitively, many people would say, got to be one or the other. But there's just no fact of the matter about which one it is pre-measurement. So it doesn't exist in that way pre-measurement. There's no classical property, which is it has.
Right. I would agree with that, but I'm not sure. Does that you're saying that it's therefore relational because it could be both without being one?
I'm saying it's therefore relational because depending on how you measure it, you're getting one or the other. So if you measure in one way, so the very same thing, if you measure in one way, you'll get particle. If you measure the very same thing in a different way, you get wave. So what it is depends on how we measure it. Now there are ways out. I mean, you can be a many worlds person. I mean, so it's not like I'm not saying this is a knockdown argument, but this is one. To me, the way I interpret quantum mechanics is just false to say, well, it's got to be something there. No, there's not. What there is some equations that describe the way things are, and there's no fact of the matter about what thing is there. In fact, there's not even a thing to be there until it's measured. No classical thing anyway.
Yeah, okay, I think I get what you're saying. Yeah, I would definitely think there is definitely a thing there, and the wave function itself, I would say, be representing an actual physical thing that exists rather than just the relation.
Well, that wave function realism is one view, but it's a very strange view because what the wave function represents is a probability wave. It doesn't seem like a physical thing. It seems more like an epistemic thing, like a thing about what observers will find when they look. And so you have things like entanglement, and so the whole thing about entanglement. It's like there can't be a thing there. The probability distribution is there. That's definitely there. But whether that's sometimes people call psiontic, the interpretation of that thing as being a thing. But even so, that's what kind of thing is it? It's not a thing in the sense that you're talking about, like an essence or a quiddity or thisness. It doesn't seem like it's that sort of thing.
What do you mean? You've lost me on that part.
Well, what's the essence of it?
Uh, I'd say it's a thing that can be a wave or a particle.
Yeah.
Probably some thing itself that exists there, which can be either one.
Yeah, but that's sort of the idea. So this is sort of ad hominem, but that's just special pleading for classicalism. It's like there's got to be something there, but why think that if there's a consistent interpretation which says there's no thing there? What reason is there besides, well, gee, I really would like it if there were something there? That just does. I don't know. I don't feel the force of being drawn to that. I think there's a thing there when we measure it, but before that, there isn't.
Well, I would say that there's always a smaller thing as far as inductively. We always discover a smaller thing that exists there. So I'd say it's probably going to continue to be the case that we're going to discover a smaller thing.
But we haven't discovered a smaller thing in this case.
Yeah.
What we've discovered is that there's a consistent way of describing what's there where there's no thing there.
Oh, for sure. Did the same thing with space. We could describe without anything being in space the descriptions of how the planets move, like Newton did. But then we discover, oh, there's actually stuff there that actually causes it to move. And I'd say the same thing is going to apply to the wave function. We're probably going to discover a smaller thing. I'm just inductively, because we always discover a smaller thing. And so it seems likely to me that there is a thing there to be discovered. I don't think it just stops at the wave function. I don't think that is the essence of reality that we've bumped into yet. I think it's more likely there's a smaller thing.
More likely in the sense that it's always been that way, so that's an inductive argument.
Yep.
Yeah, but there's no good, I mean, so the induction, the reason why you feel confident in that is because you've been doing induction over classical things. But this is a non-classical thing, and so induction fails because they are not similar enough for you to infer from the previous basis to this one.
What do you mean? Aren't there lots of discoveries that have been made in quantum mechanics for smaller things too?
Well, no. What do you mean? For smaller things. So it depends on what you mean by thing. So I think not.
Waves, different kinds of waves, different kinds of fields, different kinds of particles that interact, neutrinos, to smaller quarks, to gluons, to
right. All those things are things which we observe or measure. We haven't discovered anything which is there when we're not measuring it.
We haven't discovered anything which is there when we're not measuring it. So
right.
Because we couldn't see it when we're not measuring it. So yeah, for sure.
So there's no reason to think there are any things there when we're not measuring them.
I don't think I would follow that. So because I think that we think they are there when we're not measuring them. That's why we make the predictions.
That's because you're stuck in this classical way of thinking and haven't really fully internalized the results of quantum mechanics.
Well, usually they think all the fields are there even when we're not measuring them, right?
Who thinks that?
Most of physicists?
No.
Really?
Really? Well, it depends on what you, I mean, so go and do the surveys on what the interpretations of quantum mechanics are. So there are some vocal proponents like Sean Carroll. There are some physicists, I mean, I like Sean. He's a nice guy. I've talked to him. I think he's very smart, but there are some people who think that, well, anyway, that he's not the best voice for interpreting quantum mechanics because he's a many worlds guy. And there's really, I mean, the many worlds, all of those kinds of interpretations of quantum mechanics, the many worlds hypothesis, the de Broglie wave, a particle, a pilot wave stuff, all of those things want there to be some determinate way things are. And it's not, well, it's not, there's absent a pining away for the old days. There just isn't really a reason to postulate those things. And by the old days, I mean, you know, Newtonian determinism, where there are things there that are described in certain ways and so forth and so on.
Because I have the polls of the physicists.
Yeah.
I mean,
what do they say?
Copenhagen 42%, de Broglie 0%, Everett 18, information theoretical 24.
Exactly. So what I've been giving you is a version of Copenhagen.
Well, the Copenhagen doesn't say anything about ontology. It's indeterminate. It's not. It doesn't.
No, it does say something about ontology. What it says is there's no thing there. What's there is what's measured.
That was not my understanding when I've talked to physicists about this, that the Copenhagen doesn't say anything about ontology. It's just purely descriptive. This is what we can measure. It doesn't tell us one way or the other. That was my understanding. It doesn't make a declaration about ontology.
Well, it depends. So there are different versions, I guess, that you could have of this, but it's an epistemic interpretation, which says that the reason why I brought this all up was because you were saying most physicists would say there's a thing there. But I was saying that's not the case. Most physicists don't think that there is a thing there. In fact, they either think that, so they certainly don't think, most physicists don't think that the wave function is a thing, the psiontic interpretation. They don't think that, so one way of reading the Copenhagen interpretation is that what it tells us is what we will observe when we measure something, and it's silent on the case about what is there when we don't measure the thing. And so that's what I was saying. And then I've added the further thing that absent a pining away for classical days of yesteryear, there is no reason to think there is any such thing when you're not measuring it. So I was doing the two things combined together. So so let's say you're right that the Copenhagen is neutral on ontology, then the only reason for thinking that there is some kind of determinate thing there is a pining away for the classical world of Newton. But quantum mechanics suggests that, well, the world is quantum mechanical, and that's, all there is to it. That's the complete description of what's going on there. There's nothing more.
Where does that come in as a reason? Like, why would we believe that is the case, that the quantum mechanical descriptions are describing the fundamental nature rather than just something? And when I say that the wave function exists, I don't mean literally the wave function. I'm saying the wave function describes something that exists.
Well, there are some people who think the wave function literally exists. David Albert is one of these guys.
Yep. I wasn't trying to be that specific with my labeling. So, because from my understanding, most physicists think there is something there that it describes that does exist independent of our description of it. That is my understanding.
But that's not what they think, because you just read the numbers. 42% of them think Copenhagen. And what that says is what's there is what you observe. And there's no reason to think anything else. Like, well, every question that you can ask about nature is answered by the Copenhagen interpretation as saying, well, if you want to know what's there, go and measure it. And then that tells you what's there. But it doesn't say anything. In fact, it says it's an ill-formed question to ask what's there before you measure it, because the job of science is to predict observations. And so it's an ill-formed question to say there's something there before we measure it. To say there's something there is simply to say you can measure it, and nothing more. So absent an independent reason to think that there is a thing there, something that behaves classically and we could discover later or whatever. I mean, quantum mechanics says that we've discovered everything already. Certainly we have to integrate gravity, and so there's going to be some additions, but we're not going to rewrite the rules of quantum mechanics. They are the most firm laws of physics we've ever discovered. The whole standard model of physics is basically a quantum field theory, and it's not complete, obviously, but there's no evidence at all that we're going to learn some new mysterious thing, which is sort of like the whole point that I've been making this entire time, something that's relational. Like, we observe it and then we come up with these outcomes. There's no reason on this picture to think there's some hidden quality, some thisness or something which we could discover its properties. There's no, I don't know. So there's just,
well, I definitely grant that we don't have any hard evidence either way, obviously, but yeah. I would definitely like to, if you have any papers or something saying that most physicists interpret the Copenhagen interpretation to be an ontological fact about reality, I would like to see that, because this is just choose your favorite theory. It's doesn't say anything about ontology. Most of them, as far as I understand, choose the Copenhagen as just the epistemic thing. It says nothing about ontology. I have never seen them say that.
Every question we could ask about nature is answered by measurement.
Right, but I think they just...
So there are no questions about nature which can't be answered in this way. That's one way of thinking about the Copenhagen interpretation. So if you have intuitions about there being something else there, which you could discover or talk about when in absent measuring, then you're wanting the world to be classical, but the world isn't classical. There's no reason to think that the world is classical, except for us wanting it to be that way. All the evidence seems to suggest that it isn't.
That's the part I'm not following, because as far as I know, from most of the lectures I've seen, they think there's something there. The Copenhagen isn't it. There's usually more. Like, the Copenhagen doesn't explain everything. There's many problems that it can't solve, like the bridging quantum and general relativity, quantum mechanics and general relativity. So I don't, like, if you have any references for that, I'd like to see it. But as far as I know,
Well, string theory solves that problem, by the way. And string theory, in its the version that does solve it, is a quantum field theory.
I am
So,
familiar. Yes,
okay, well,
that's
so
one of the that's
that
one of
so
the
so quantum theory can solve that problem. You may not like the solution, but it certainly can solve that. And as of yet, we don't have any hard empirical reason to think that superstring theory is true. We have a lot of theoretical reasons, actually, like for example, that there's no other consistent theory which can do all those things. That string theory, the mathematics of it can't be tinkered with in any way and have you any loopholes that let you adjust parameters any way that you want it. Like that, it also has far-ranging effects in other areas, which it wasn't originally applied to or come up with. So there, this is Richard David's idea of non-empirical confirmation, which I think is an interesting idea. So some people don't like it. That's fine. But so
I think most people don't like it. I think it's a very minority view
yeah.
because it kind of predicts everything. I think that was the main criticism.
What's that?
String theory predicts everything. Like there's nothing it wouldn't predict. It predicts literally everything that could ever occur.
Well, if you're talking about the landscape or the swamp, the swamp and all that stuff, yeah. So there's the multiverse predicts everything. String theory doesn't predict everything. The it, anyway, so I think that's a different issue. But certainly, string theory is not a minority view in physics. It's still attracting good graduate students, and there are vocal people who say that it shouldn't be doing that and that they're wasting their time and blah blah blah. But what time will tell on that. But so the whole idea of non-empirical confirmation is supposed to be there may be other reasons for thinking the theory is correct besides what it predicts. So that's the Richard David idea.
Yeah, Sean Carroll also was arguing for that, saying that we're past the stage of testability.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's a respectable idea. But that's not the point. So I only brought that up because you said string theory. I mean, you said quantum mechanics doesn't solve everything, but on certain interpretations it does. And that's what's so great about string theory is that it's a quantum theory which does solve all of that stuff. Now, it'd be nice to have some empirical confirmation. I agree, but I think there are many other reasons for thinking that the theory is true. And I listed a few of them just now. But anyway, so that's I think wrong to say quantum mechanics can't solve everything. It does. And there's no reason to think that there's anything more. There just isn't any reason to think that there's anything more, which doesn't amount to saying it would be nice if the world was classical.
Yeah, for sure. I'd have to look into it more because from my understanding, most physicists, I think just going off of just physicists, I think string theory is a minority last time I checked. And I think.
Well, you should look up the polls on that. It depends on what physics. Are you talking about physics in general or theoretical physics, particle physics? I mean, who you're talking to? There's no other real contender. I mean, loop quantum gravity, people talk about that stuff, but there's no other anyway. So we can look that up. So
yeah, if you can, please find that for me because I want to find that. I haven't found any that show it's a majority. I usually just go with one's physics lecture places, what conferences. Those are the polls I find. I haven't seen any that show it's string theory as a majority one. If you have one, please find it too because I love these things. But yeah.
Well, it depends on who you're asking. So physics generally is different. I think that's, I don't know. I don't really. Anyway, so that's a different issue.
Yeah, if you have cosmology conferences, just anybody. Show me anybody. I want to see them.
Yeah, well, I think if you look at theoretical physicists, no one has a. Well, anyway, so that's an empirical question. I'll look for some stuff and send you some things that I think are respectable. But even if that isn't the case. I think, as I said before, string theory is widely maligned for reasons that people are reluctant to recognize how science should be done in the 21st century.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting topic, actually, because I've never actually tried to debate string theory. I haven't looked at it that much. So this is an interesting perspective I'd like to hear more about. What do you mean by maligned for reasons of doing the science, the testability thing mostly?
Yeah. Well, yeah. So there's a lot of popular hype against string theory. There's even a couple of books. The End of Science was one very famous one, and there's people with popular blogs and they're railing against it. And there's just a lot of in the sort of popular physics community. By the way, I'm not a physicist, obviously.
Yes, you are.
I
You're a
thought,
physicist and a theist and a Hindu
yeah,
and an
exactly.
idealist and a panpsychist all in one.
Well, in the multiverse, I'm all those things, and my beard is much longer in those other universes. Um, but I mean, I did want to be a physicist when I first started out, but then I quickly realized that I was just good enough at math to recognize that I wasn't good enough at math to do this stuff in a serious way. So I went into philosophy where we could play around with ideas. But I have been like a lifelong interest in physics, and I mean, I first found out about string theory when I was in high school, and I was reading all sorts of stuff about it, and I've followed the progress of it for last 20 years at least. So I'm not an expert on it, but I do have a special place in my heart for it. Um,
I've noticed you talk about it quite fervently with passion.
yeah. Well, I think it's got a bad rap, as I was saying before, because people are, well, it doesn't make any predictions, or it's been, falsified by not finding the super partners at the large. Well, I think that, and that it looks like a ad, and now we have this book out. Well, they're, lost in math and subdued, but I think naturalness and these things are more serious than that. Um,
Yeah, because most of the criticism I heard, they use the Pauli thing of it's not even wrong kind of a criticism.
yeah, exactly. So that's I think being stuck in an old way of thinking. And Ed Witten famously said, who's one of the more,
M
obviously the
theory
most
guy. Yep.
world famous string theorists in the world. He famously said, "Look, string theory is at least in principle empirically testable because a string could pop up like right before you, and be like, oh, there's a fucking string. Well, that's one way of confirming it." And it also, in certain ways, I think he makes this comment as well, which I think is important, which is that you can imagine a race of beings who discovered string theory before they discovered gravity. And then for them, gravity would be a prediction. And so for us, it wasn't that way. But still, it could have been the case. So it's just an accident of history, you might think, that gravity wasn't a prediction of string theory. I think that's a serious thing to say. I don't know. Anyway, so
Well,
I think they're in.
why would that be a serious thing to say? Because that would apply to any scientific theory. Like if we discovered general relativity before Newtonian gravity, the same thing would apply. So I think that would be any new theory that explains post hoc data that we've
Well,
discovered.
those things don't predict gravity.
Oh yeah, it was just so any.
So the idea is that string theory predicts gravity. It predicts that gravity would be a thing. Um, and so if we didn't know about gravity, but knew about string theory, we would predict that there would be such a force. It just so happens that we went in the other direction. We discovered gravity first.
Well, you could take any theory like many worlds, multiverse, and have some explanation of the universe and say, well, if this is true, we would expect gravity or whatever. So if we take any of the modern theories and say we knew about these 500 years ago, discovered them before general relativity, the same thing seems to it would apply, wouldn't it?
Well, what things do they predict that general relativity? And so I'm not sure what you're saying. So
Uh,
I mean, one of the consequences of string theory is very specific, that a certain kind of particle is predicted, the graviton or something like it, which carries this certain sort of force and so forth and so on. A very specific prediction is made by the equations of string theory about what this thing would look like. And so, that's a big deal. But these other theories that you're talking about, I don't see the same thing applying to them unless I'm misunderstanding it.
oh yeah,
So
for sure.
what thing falls out of the theory of general relativity from the equations of it, which in retrospect we can see as a prediction?
Retrospect, we could see as a prediction. So I would say like any model that describes everything we know now, 500 years ago would all be seen as predictions. It predicts everything they didn't know 500 years ago. So if you're saying string theory makes a new prediction about some particle we haven't discovered yet, that's great. That's great evidence for sure. If we discovered it, that would be empirical evidence of
Theory
string theory.
predicts that would be such a thing as gravity, whereas the other theories don't. They gets built into them, so they don't predict it. They're just compatible with it or describe it, but they don't make it. Doesn't. It's not a consequence of the equations that there would be such a thing.
Right, but string theory starts with other what's it starting points that aren't predicted. They're the starting points. So every theory starts with some axioms and then builds off of those to have some
Yeah, totally.
consequences.
Yeah, so string theory starts with strings and the properties of strings, and from that, it follows that there would be such a thing as gravity.
And the others would start with things like the observation of gravity and then build off of that to make predictions about the multiverse or whatever. Um, I don't see which of those would be preferable. Actually, maybe the gravity one would be preferable because it's something we
Well,
know
no, the
exists.
idea, so we knew about gravity. So we knew about gravity before we discovered string theory. But so imagine that we had discovered string theory first, then it would predict that there would be gravity, and then we could go and test that. So it so happens that it went the other way, so that doesn't count as a prediction. But these other theories, they don't make that kind of they don't make that kind of prediction. So Newtonian physics doesn't predict something that we already knew would be the case. And then we'd say, well, if we discovered this first, we would see from these equations that there would be such a thing as this.
So for example, Newtonian mechanics predicted certain ways the bodies in space moved, and we discovered other planets or other galaxies which he couldn't see, and it would predict their movement too because we didn't know about them. So that would seem to work in the same kind of way. Like, we discovered Newtonian mechanics, and then it applies to all these other galaxies we didn't know about yet. How is that different?
I'm not sure I see the analogy.
Because you're saying
So if we knew about the other galaxies first and then discovered the equations of Newtonian mechanics, it would confirm it would fit with them. So I guess, but there's no new force which Newtonian mechanics predicts, or which falls out of the equations, which if you didn't know about it already, you would discover it from studying the equations.
so. So if you're saying we didn't know about gravity and we discovered string theory before we knew about gravity, and then tested for gravity.
If we just knew about string theory but not gravity, then by studying the equations, we would be led to expect that there was something called gravity, which acted in a certain way.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, that's interesting.
Right. So a lot of people think that string theory has made no. So one thing Witten said was that people accuse string theory of not making any predictions, but that's sort of like a historical accident. The fact that Newton discovered gravity before, or postulated, or Einstein, whoever you want to fucking credit with that, probably Einstein, since Newton described gravity and Einstein has discovered what it was in a sense, the curvature of space. But so the equations of Einstein describe that stuff, and but well, yeah. So do they predict anything though? Which, if you didn't know about that, you'd be led to believe that such and such a thing was true. Um,
And you're
yeah,
saying that the prediction, because it's a fundamental force, is more impressive than like a gravitational waves of black holes kind of a prediction, which is a consequence of the gravity, but it doesn't explain the gravity.
well, yeah. So suppose that we knew about gravitational waves before Einstein's equations. Like, suppose that we didn't study theoretical physics but built these things, and then we discovered these waves. And then if Einstein had come along and written these equations, we would say, aha, the equations themselves predict that we would find this thing. So it's only a historic. And then you would say, no, you didn't make a prediction. Well, so
Yeah. My concern there would be is
that it's kind of only an accident of history. And in fact, if relativity theory is true, then there are ways of slicing up time in which the one came before the other. But it's kind of just a historical accident that this one came first. So that if string theory came first, we would be here saying, look at this fucking great theory, it predicted gravity. Just like we said about about Einstein, we said, look at this great theory, it predicted gravitational waves. So it's just historical accident that we didn't discover the waves first and then the equation second.
Yeah, I think that's a great example, the Einstein one. So if Einstein created his theory after we had discovered gravitational waves, I would argue that he could have just been using post hoc reasoning. He could have been using the data we have and trying to make a theory that explains the data or gives us a reason to believe the data after the fact, which is less impressive.
Yeah, but that's different though, because and especially in the case of string theory, what's incredible about it, I mean, the history of it is that it was invented for a completely different purpose. The equations were not, they didn't come up with those equations to try to explain gravity or anything related to it. In fact, it was a model of the strong nuclear force. And only by studying the equations, they recognize, aha, this thing actually predicts a kind of quantum gravity. So then people got excited about it. That was the first superstring revolution of the 80s. That's what prompted all of the excitement. And then Witten came along with the second superstring revolution. But the reason why it became so prominent in the first place was because the equations were invented to describe something else. And then people, by studying it, realized, wait a minute, this has implications for this other thing, which it wasn't invented for at all, which is, not nothing.
Yeah, it's definitely impressive to be the ability to create a model that has nothing to do with a field, and then through consilience say it has predictions in other fields or explains things in other fields. Yeah, I definitely understand that as a good evidence base. So yeah, I'm gonna have to look into this more because I've never studied string theory that much. It doesn't come up much in our debates against God. So, but yeah, that's
Well, it should, because it's the basis of the multiverse. So it's like, if people are talking about multiverses, I mean, you have to, like I said, get a couple. So there's three things that you got to do. So first, there's the string theory. String theory has like 10 to the 500 solutions. So in the old days, it was hoped, that there would be one unique solution, which was predicted the constants universe. It doesn't do that. There's, that's the landscape. There's all these different solutions. We haven't found any of them in there that are like our world, by the way. That's one of the big problems, obviously. But people assume it's in there somewhere. So you have that. So there's all these different consistent solutions to the equation. So all these different possible ways that a universe could be according to string theory. And then you have the eternal inflation model, which comes from a different area altogether. That's cosmology. So this is, theoretical physics. Those are different areas. So eternal inflation says, well, here's a thing which just would go on forever. There's no reason that it would stop. And then you combine those two things. So there's 10 to the 500 solutions plus this mechanism for generating all the different possibilities. You put those two together, and then you get some reason to think that maybe there's a multiverse. Anyway, so they dovetail in that way. So I think if you're going to believe in a multiverse, at least string theory should be part of your reason for taking it seriously. So I'm surprised that hasn't come up. But even if you do like that, though, so what are strings? Well, strings are described in these structural functional ways that we were talking about earlier. They're defined in terms of what they do, are they joined, how they vibrate, etc. So even they're thinking that there's something which is there. I think. I mean, look, I want the world to be classical too, but I just don't see why, given the way the science has progressed, that we should think that the world is classical in this way. Doing that seems to me to be the same mistake that the Goth types of the world are making. Well, it's got to be some way, so let's put consciousness in there. And, well, it's got to be some way, so let's put some mysterious property that we've never even heard of and have no reason to believe in there. They just seem like equally desperate moves.
yeah, I can grant that, like, because I haven't studied this at all. I've just seen so many criticisms of string theory. I tend to think that that's not usually the position adopted in physics. That's all I got for evidence. I haven't studied it enough to know. Yeah, so aren't there versions of the multiverse that don't include string theory, though?
I'm not. Yeah, I mean, to the extent that people are suspicious of string theory, I think so. But then, what reason would you have to believe that the constants in those worlds are different? Because that's what the string theory gives you. There are all these different solutions to the equations, each of which result. And that's one of the wonderful things about strings theory, is that once you solve the equations, every single property of that universe is nailed down and follows deductively from the math. So what properties every particle has, every interaction is defined by the equations. So if all you have is eternal inflation, then why wouldn't it just be eternally inflating the same set of constants? There's no reason to think just from that alone that you're going to get all these different values.
I think that's why he adds in, with eternal inflation, the vacuum states, and that's how he gets the variation, I think, with the vacuum states. I think Sean Carroll uses the model where it's vacuum states and early universe inflation, and that's how he explains it without string theory. One of his models. Guth's early universe inflation and Casimir effect, vacuum state, something like that. Those are the two in
But what about the vacuum states determines that there will be different constants?
over my head. No idea.
Okay, well, I mean, yeah. So I mean, I'd have to look more. And to be honest, I don't really know that paper of Sean's. And I mean, I'm sure he has good reason for thinking it. But I didn't know he was against string theory. I didn't think that that was true. Is that the
Maybe I'm
case?
gonna have to look into it more for sure, definitely, because
Yeah.
I have
And
not spent much time thinking about this. So it's definitely an interesting topic.
yeah, it's a good topic. People should think about it more. I think that, yeah, string theory challenges a lot of philosophical intuitions that people have. And, the dualities in string theory, which are incredibly difficult to think your way through, that, in different versions of the theory, you're going to have distances that are very far apart become very close together. And the two mathematical descriptions are equivalent to each other. So in one way of describing it, you and I are infinitely far apart, and another way of describing it, we are very close together, and they are equivalent descriptions. And so that's very challenging. And the whole idea of holography and all that stuff comes out of these ideas that you can describe space as being a two-dimensional projection of the
Holographic
boundaries of
principle,
the
yeah.
universe and all of that sort of stuff. I don't think you get those ideas without some version of string theory in the background.
You need string theory for the holographic principle?
Yeah.
Haven't heard that either. We have to find that too. If you have some papers on that, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, there's tons of papers on it. That's easy to do.
Because yeah, I know the holographic principle has essentially been accepted universally as being true in physics, as far as I know. But I didn't realize there was a connection to string theory there. That I haven't seen.
Yeah, these ideas all sort of come out of thinking. I mean, this comes from Juan Maldacena. Do you know who he is? I think he's the originator of this idea. I mean, and he's interpreted by Lenny Susskind, who's the
Yep,
physicist.
definitely heard of Lenny Susskind.
Yeah, so Maldacena is like, he sends him a cryptic email and it's like, particles are black holes, and then Lenny Susskind comes up with the more palatable description of that. But so I think all of these ideas stem from thinking about string theory and quantum mechanics, and so I mean, I don't know. There's a lot to learn there.
Yeah, we got a super chat, by the way. So Justin Maurer said any model that proposed at this point would have to retroactively predict gravity, or it wouldn't be accepted right.
Yeah, that's true.
I think he's objecting to your claim that since string theory predicted gravity, it comes out of the models, whereas the other ones don't. The other ones, gravity doesn't come out of the equations. It's retroactively put into the equations. So that's where string theory stands out in your presentation of it. It's that because gravity is a consequence of other things, it's not just made to fit gravity, whereas the other models are made to fit gravity, is my interpretation of what you said.
Yeah. Well, so like take loop quantum gravity. The that theory was invented to explain gravitational interactions and quantum mechanics. The theory itself already assumed that there was such a thing as gravity, and then tries to give an account of it. Whereas it's for string theory, that wasn't the case.
Cool. Definitely looking into this more. I've got a bunch of websites up right now saved in my favorites. Yeah, it was great talking to you. It was fun as always. Really appreciate you coming
totally.
on.
Yeah. So, and also be sure to read that book, Everything Must Go.
Yes, please find me those papers. I want to know about the physicists and string theory, and whether you need string theory for the holographic principle. That's a good one, because that one, I know the holographic principle is very common. And if there's a connection to that with string theory, I definitely like to know that for sure.
Cool. Well, as always, great. I didn't get to talk to you about Hume, so you stop.
Oh yeah, what is your objection with my use of Hume?
Well, fallibilism and the problem of induction have nothing to do with each other.
Did I say they did?
Yeah. You said the problem of induction was just taken care of by fallibilism, which I don't agree with.
I mean, I definitely don't think it's solved. Since we can have knowledge without certainty, we can claim to have knowledge about inductive facts without certainty.
Yeah, but the whole problem of induction is that induction is justified by induction. So there's no good reason to accept inductive claims, because the only reason for accepting inductive claims is induction. So it's circular.
But we can still claim to have knowledge, right? So,
well, knowledge is a different claim. Yeah.
So right. So that's the only thing I'm claiming there, is that the problem of induction doesn't stop us from having knowledge. That's what I mean by solved, because usually in the context of precept,
well, it stops you from having inductive knowledge.
Or what does that mean? So
knowledge based on induction.
Hume's
point was, I dropped the pen, I expect it to fall, but there's no good reason to expect that it will fall as opposed to fly around in a circle or detonate as a nuclear bomb. They're all equally justified by induction, which is to say, not at all.
And so, granting fallibilism, we can't say we have knowledge of induction there, knowledge of something.
Well, fallibilism just means that you don't need certainty in order to get knowledge. But here, there's a question about why you would have knowledge at all, because the knowledge you're claiming to have is based on induction, and the justification that you would give is induction, and the justification for that is induction, and so you don't have any justification. So it's a claim. So you assume that you have knowledge, but Hume's point is that you aren't justified in that assumption.
Oh, yeah, sure. So I totally agree with that. Usually in the context, this is against presuppositionalists who say you can have knowledge of nothing without God, essentially. And they usually claim the reason you can have knowledge. What?
Yeah, sorry, I just got told my time is up.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So the reason I bring up fallibilism is because precepts say you can't have certainty, and that's the reason you can't have knowledge. So, and then they just bring up induction as one of a big problem in philosophy. They just list a bunch of big problems in philosophy and say, you can't have certainty because of these. And just saying you don't need certainty kind of undercuts their point. Not specifically to solve the problem of induction, it's just to address the precepts ramblings. That's
I don't really know what a precept is, but
presuppositional apologetics. They say that to have any kind of knowledge at all, you need to presuppose God exists. You need to have a God there.
And no, that's stupid. That's obviously fucking dumb. But I heard you talking to someone and you said fallibilism solves the problem of induction. So I think the problem of induction is more serious than I think. Who knows if it's solvable at all? I've seen lots of people try, and some of them are semi-convincing, but I think it's a big problem in philosophy. Anyway, so yeah.
Totally agree. So I was probably saying that as a specific response to a presuppositionalist, just to address their point of how they're using the problem of induction.
Yeah, awesome. All right, man, I got to head out, but great talking to you as always. And,
great talking to you too.
I'll keep in contact and all that stuff. I'll send you that stuff, and we'll take it. And probably I was wrong about all that stuff, so you don't have to worry about it anyway.
Awesome. Have a nice day. I'm going to get some coffee again.